In this video, we'll go through basic Rook Endgames, as well as one Rook Endgame that I dreamed of. Thank you to Agadmater for giving me the opportunity to being featured on his channel. This is FIDE Master Noam Vitenberg, back with another video. I stream 4 times a week on Twitch, 19 o'clock Central European Time, Thursday and Monday, 11 o'clock Central European Time, Saturday and Sunday. Check it out, links in the description below. Often we have heard that the best defense is offense. This is highly applicable to endgames where the defending side frequently strives for counterplay. However, every rule has an exception, and the passive defense with the rook on the 8th rank on the defending side and the pawn being on the 6th rank by the pressing side is one example. Let us see if the passive defense holds with an f-pawn, and if not, how the position can be won. Alright, we have a position with the passive defense by black here, keeping the rook on the 8th rank, defending against checkmates. Because as quickly as the black rook departs from the 8th rank, there will come rook b8, checkmate. And now, white is in fact able to go rook b7. The rook has to keep shuffling on the 8th rank, and then rook g7, check, very important move. Now after king f8, king h8 is an alternative as well. However, it runs into rook h7, king g8, f7, king f8, rook h8, king moves, and then we are able to capture the black rook as well as promote our own pawn. And now, king f8. Here white employs the same idea, rook h7, threatening a checkmate on h8. So black is obligated to move their king either to e8 or to g8 to defend against the checkmate. Now if they go to g8, this is a transposition to the previous variation. So let's investigate what happens if king e8 is played. Here white delivers a check, king d7, and successfully swaps off the rooks, and after f7 there is nothing stopping the f-pawn from promoting. Now, I'll give you 5 seconds to figure out if the passive defense still holds if there is a g-pawn instead of an f-pawn for the pressing side. Alright, in this position, in fact, it's actually a draw, as if white attempts to implement a similar idea. Black is obligated to go king h8 in this position. King f8 is in fact met with king h7, rook c1, rook g8, king e7, rook a8, and now white will be able to go g7 followed by king g8, reaching the Lucena position, which I've covered in one of my previous videos. So now, king h8 instead, rook h7 check, king g8, and it turns out that white is unable to make progress, as an attempt to push the pawn further with g7 would backfire, as then black would go rook c6, forcing the white king to move, and after that black will actually be the one winning, taking the rook on h7. The thing is that geometrically the chessboard is 8 times 8. Hence there is no i7 square on the board, so if rook i7 was an opportunity in this position, then white would in fact be winning. Let's look at this interesting example. Still a g-pawn this time, but white now has 2 g-pawns. I'll give you 3.4 seconds to figure out, is this position winning or is it drawn? Alright, it turns out that the additional g-pawn makes all the difference. White's plan will be to trade off rooks favorably and then promote the remaining pawn. Let's see how white will do this. Rook b6. White is intending to go g7, followed by rook f6 and then rook f8. Now, this would force black to capture an f8. Pawn takes f8. King takes f8 and go king h7. And in this position there is nothing stopping the g-pawn from promoting. Black has one trick against this idea, rook f8 in this position. Now what would you play here as white? If you said g7, I completely understand you. You want to follow up with your plan and continue the idea of rook f6, rook f8. You expected that the black rook still has to shuffle on the 8th rank, and then you will successfully execute your plan. However, there is a gorgeous trick here for black, rook f6, forcing the white rook to capture on f6, and after that the black king has no squares, is stalemated, and the game is a draw. Hence g5 is the move, forcing the rook to depart from the f8 square. Now if the rook departs from the a rank, then there will simply be rook b8 check. So let's say rook f4, rook b8, forcing the rook to go back. And then white will be able to go king h7 and push their g-pawn until it promotes. And if black instead moves the rook along the a rank, there is nothing stopping white from executing the desired idea. And now, after the rook moves, there will come rook f8 as previously discussed. And then the pawn endgame will in fact be winning. And now, to a very interesting example that I dreamed of in fact. In this position I was unfortunately playing with the white pieces in my dream against a good friend, and I remember that I lost this game ultimately. The question to you, what's the most thematic maneuver of black in this position? Alright, black has a very typical idea in Rook Endgames, that is to go Rook g3. The idea is illustrated very well after the move King c2, e4 starting by pushing the pawn, and after a move like Rook e2, there is coming Rook b3. Now the Rook on b3 has numerous benefits. This is a typical plan seen in converting positions with an additional passed pawn and some pawns on another side of the board. Black's rook in fact protects the b5 pawn, which could be a potential target for white with Rook h2, Rook h5 ideas. The thing is that the b5 pawn is at the beginning of the pawn chain b5a4 namely. So the a4 pawn is conveniently defended by the b5 pawn. There are no pawns conveniently defending the b5 pawn, but the rook on b3 will fulfill this duty. Furthermore, the rook on b3 also supports black's e-pawn, which will later go to e3 and be conveniently protected by the rook. The final function it fulfills from this square is that it attacks the pawn on b2, forcing either the white's king or white's rook to defend the b2 pawn. And now, I'll make a couple of moves that I made in the game. Here I went king b4 in the game, rook b3, king c5, and in my dream my opponent went e4 trying to push the pawn to e3. I do believe that in my dream I was simply trying to replicate an idea I had previously seen from Mark Dvoretsky's endgame manual. The thing is, however, that to take the pawn on b2 is a little bit simpler than to go e4 in this position. And now, the final diagram. This is the position I left you off with in my previous video, and I asked you, how do you evaluate this position here? If you think that white is winning, because they will be able to run up with their king to a7, black is not able to stop this, and then later go rook b8, rook b6, king b7, and then push a7, a8, your opinion would have been considered correct until 1924, when a Czech chess composer was able to discover that this position is in fact drawn. Vanchura is his name. In this position, rook f1 is the drawing plan. The thing is that if white ever goes a7, black will happily go back to a1, and now there is no idea to go up with the king to a7. Since the pawn has already been pushed here. The thing is that white's rook is tied down to defending the a7 pawn, so it has no squares, and if white's king ever tries to support the a7 pawn by going to the b6 square, then black will start delivering checks. More details on this position in my previous video. Anyhow, king g4 is more critical, rook f6, king g5, rook g6 check, king f5, rook f6, and the thing is that if white now tries to support the a6 pawn by running up to the pawn with the king, black will start to give checks on the side of the board to shuffle between the squares on the f file. Another important feature of the position is that the rook is very well placed in f6 because it forces white's rook on a8 to be tied down to the defense of the a6 pawn. One final detail to keep in mind. If it was white in this position, then white would actually be able to win the game going rook g8. This would force king takes g8 or king f7 when white would play rook f8. And after both the rooks get traded off, so let's say rook g8, king takes g8, king takes f6, black's king is not in time to stop the a6 pawn from promoting. If you made it this far into the video, I do hope you enjoyed the video and also found the content rather educational, and I hope you enjoyed these Rook Endgames. Now, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, link will be in the description. You could share it, and you could like the video. See you in the next one.